Janine di Giovanni, thank you for joining us here at the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA for this special discussion that we're going to have with you in this World Press Freedom Day. It's a great pleasure, honor, and thank you for your time for being with us here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Let me read a little bit from your bio, which is really accomplished, so we can make sure that all of our viewers have deep knowledge about all of your accomplishments. We must say that you've been a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. You are currently directing a project sponsored by the UN Democracy Fund that promotes transitional justice in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. In 2019, you won a Guggenheim Fellowship for your research in Middle East, and in 2020, you received the American Academy of Arts and Letters highest prize for nonfiction, the Black Dot, for your body of work spanning 3 decades. You are a global affairs columnist for Foreign Policy Magazine and The National in Abu Dhabi. I must say that among all other things, you've also been awarded the International Women Media Foundation's prestigious Courage Award. You've reported from several war conflict zones across the globe, including Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, so many countries. And I would like
Syria.
to start Syria, of course.
Syria.
And we are discussing about the art of war in terms of how you, as a foreign correspondent, as a war correspondent in conflict zones, you've been in very difficult circumstances to bring up stories from people who've been in these war zones and asking them what has happened to them and give life to these stories. I would like to start by asking you, first of all, how all these experiences as a war correspondent have transformed your personality over these decades of work.
It's a really good question, which, of course, being a foreign correspondent yourself, you understand. Well, my first real conflict was the Gaza and the West Bank during the first Intifada or uprising in the early 90s. And I think I had no intention to become a war reporter. I wanted to be an academic, actually. And once I saw the things that I saw there, it was almost as though I couldn't unsee it. I remember going to my very first refugee camp outside of Bethlehem and being completely appalled at the conditions and also so angered by the injustice of the occupation. So I wrote an article that was very passionate and very inflammatory in a sense. It was about a Jewish lawyer who defended Palestinians in military court called Felicia Langer. And this woman really inspired me because she had this tremendous thirst for justice. She just believed that victims deserve to have justice. So I wrote about her, and then it became a book eventually. And by the time I finished that book, the war in Bosnia broke out. So I was working at the time for the Sunday Times of London. I was living in London, and I went to Sarajevo. And Sarajevo from 1992 to 1995 was besieged by Bosnian Serb forces. And besieged meant no water, no electricity, no heating for the population, for the civilians who were, desperately suffering from this. And I mean, to do it, sorry, I'm in New York City, so the sound of ambulance outside. So to live like this for 3 years for people was absolutely soul destroying. But for me as a reporter, to be there was a great honor because I was allowed to enter people's lives, to understand what it was that kept them going, their resilience, their endurance, and also to understand the complexities of the Balkans, which are, a very, very difficult political and geopolitical situation. So once that ended in 1995, I continued going back to Bosnia and still do to this day to work on war crimes and war criminals that might have, escaped justice. But I then went to Africa. And in 1994, I had been in Rwanda when the genocide killed 1 million people in 3 months during the summer. And it was a horrific thing to witness, but it was, in terms of being a reporter, um, it really taught me a lot about humanity and also about how to work in these kind of places, with very traumatized people, with people who had suffered a tremendous amount. Like, so how do you act with the most sensitivity when you're interviewing a woman who's been raped many times, or a child who's witnessed their parents being murdered by machete? Um, and from there, I carried on working in Africa for a long time, and I love Africa. And I feel that it's a continent that's drastically underreported, um, especially in America. And I reported from Somalia and the Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone and Liberia and Zimbabwe and the Congo and South Sudan. And then 9/11 happened. And basically, well, before 9/11, I was in Chechnya, which was another horrific war, East Timor, Kosovo. The war in Kosovo kicked off, which was very short but very violent. And then 9/11. So after 9/11, literally on September 13th, I was on a raft crossing the river Oxus between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And I joined the Northern Alliance and went with them up to Kabul for the fall of Kabul, and then was in Tora Bora, um, and then immediately went to Iraq because then the neocons in America turned their focus on poor Iraq. So I stayed in Iraq for a very long time and took some time out, had a wonderful baby, and then the Arab Spring came. So the Arab Spring was another completely different way of reporting war. And you're a social media expert, but the Arab Spring really showed how Twitter and Facebook generated these revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and then Syria. And then lastly, I was in Syria where my last book was. And I just finished another book, which is about Christians in the Middle East who are being eradicated by economics, by radical jihad, such as the Islamic State. Um, yes, and so in a nutshell, there you have more than 30 years of work.
And you, as a personality, how you've been transformed during the last 3 decades of work? How you see yourself 30 years ago and how you see yourself today? How experiencing and witnessing all these traumatic scenes and pain and risks and deaths through your reporting, how all these things have changed you as a personality? In what way?
It was, I mean, I think when I first started out in the 90s, there was absolutely no kind of counseling or any kind of debriefing for reporters when they came back, especially Bosnia. I mean, Bosnia was really the first war where journalists were confronted with great danger to themselves because Sarajevo, we were living inside this city and there were snipers on the hill. So you would come outside. We all stayed in the Holiday Inn, but it wasn't a Holiday Inn. It was a building that had been completely shot up and bombed, and there was plastic on my windows, and there was constant shelling and constant sniping. So we lost colleagues, but more importantly, you could be going to visit a family in a certain part of town, and a shell would fall, and suddenly there'd be 30 people killed. One thing that's very different then and now was that then we actively, as journalists, engaged in helping. So, if someone was injured, we'd try to get them to the hospital, we'd pick them up, we'd carry them. Um, we were human beings first, really, and it actually became a great kind of emotional stress for me because everyone needed something. They needed money, they needed food, they wanted you to get their child out of Sarajevo. And one of my colleagues said to me, you're not a social worker, you're a journalist. But it was very, very hard to separate the two because we're human beings. So I'm by nature a very sensitive person. I'm not a tough, I'm not someone that could see something horrific and then sleep at night. It really takes a toll on me. Um, by the time I got to Rwanda, I was really burnt out. I mean, really burnt out. But we didn't know what burnt out was then. There were no kind of, uh, I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder did exist, but there were absolutely no specialists treating journalists, or even our editors didn't really care. If you couldn't do the job, you couldn't do the job, and they'd send someone else. So we were desperate to hang on to our position. Um, it wasn't really until I had a child in 2004. I have a son called Luca, that the horror of it, especially children, um, really, really was unbearable to me. And working in Sierra Leone in 2000, Sierra Leone was a war that was, I think, hallmarked by horrific human rights abuse, in particular, amputation. The rebel forces would amputate people at their elbow or their wrist. And the day I picked up a 6-month-old baby who had been amputated was the day I just thought, like, I can't take anymore. And you can't save everyone, but you want to, and so you can only try to to help the people you can help. And the best you can do is to get the story out there, because the more people know about it, the more that things can, there can be humanitarian relief, or, I learned a lot about how the UN works as well, the United Nations. And I, there are some very, very good people working at the UN. But I also developed a lot of scorn because of what happened at the massacre at Srebrenica and the genocide of Rwanda. Both times when the UN failed to protect civilians. And in the case of Srebrenica, 8,000 men and boys were marched into the forest and slaughtered. In Rwanda, it was a million people, which is like a staggering number. So I guess your question, like, how did I protect myself? I think there were a couple things. I think that I believed in what I do. I believe in what I do. I believe that, I'm not just doing it to earn a paycheck. I mean, we wouldn't be journalists if we were doing it for that reason, because we don't earn a lot. But I genuinely believed that there were people who did not have a voice, and they were unable to write their own story or tell their own story. And that as reporters in the field, what we do is give them a voice and give them a chance to tell their story. So that in many ways really helped me. And that, and the fact that I think that the gathering of evidence is hugely important, because, like Syria, for instance, Bashar al-Assad has effectively won the war. Now, a war criminal remaining in his position, with all of the victims, the 500,000 people who are dead, the hundreds of thousands of people who were tortured, the people who were chemically gassed, his own people. How I'm One of my students at Yale said to me, like, how does that work? He did all these terrible things and he just stays in position and that's it. But it's not just it, because eventually he will fall. And we have the evidence. We have documented, the journalists, the humanitarians, the NGOs, the human rights investigators. We have documented the war crimes. And one day, justice will reach those people who really deserve it.
You've been using a lot, from what I'm hearing, the word documenting. From what I've seen in your words, in your speeches, and in your writing, I feel that you perceive your role as a journalist basically as someone who is documenting history. And I would like to ask you how this perception you have about journalism today differentiates you from what exists right now in the world of journalism, in the world of internet-based journalism with
Yeah.
driven by clicks, ratings, and not so much about, the deep, well-sourced reporting, but on what it makes good headlines to get clicks. How you feel? Do you feel, first of all, comfortable in this environment in our days?
Not really. But to be honest, you know, I think there is so much content out there that needs to be filled, and so many platforms that you can get lost in it. And so I basically, I stick to my routine. I read the papers I read, and I read the journals I read, and I read reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and International Crisis Group. Um, and I tend to still do the projects that I do, which is to go very, very deep. I I think, it's interesting. I wrote this piece for Foreign Policy, and some of my colleagues said, well, I don't agree with you because there is still money for foreign reporting. But I think that's for television people. I think television people still have budgets. I think for print reporters, especially freelancers, it's so difficult for them. I have a great friend who's a photojournalist, a really gifted foreign correspondent, and, she finds it really hard to do the projects that she wants to do, which are all incredibly important work. And I think now we have to rely on a combination of, unless you have a staff job and you have a very, an editor who really says to you, okay, Thanos, go see what's happening with the Uyghur in China, or go to Myanmar and report from the ground there. That's pretty rare, unless you work for the BBC or CNN, um, or Sky, or something like that, and your company has a big budget. If you're a freelancer, you're going to have trouble getting your expenses together. The war in Syria was incredibly expensive to report. And even if you did it completely on a budget, which I always did, I mean, I didn't rarely stayed in hotels, I'd stay with families. But you now need war insurance. Um, and I always tell young reporters, like, do not go anywhere without it. Luckily, organizations like Reporters Sans Frontières um, help you get packages of it if you're, again, a freelancer. And that's where my concerns are. I mean, staffers are more taken care of, but freelancers, just how I started, and I think some of the best work is done by freelancers. They really need support, and they also need to take a hostile environment course. Again, very expensive. There are organizations that can help people get budgets for them, but these are kind of essentials to the field. Before you go into a conflict zone, you need to have some kind of emergency training that trains you in first aid, what to do if you're kidnapped, um, what to do if you're caught in a minefield, what to do if you're caught in a crossfire, what to do if you're in a car crash or you see a car crash, how do you get people out of the car? And, I've been lucky enough that I think I've had 3 or 4 intensive hostile environment training, but that only started after 9/11, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the only reason companies did them is because if you were hurt, they didn't want to pay, they had to pay insurance, vast amounts of money. So now it's more of a common thing to have this, it's called hostile environment training. Um, but I would urge every kind of would be or want to be war reporter that you must get this under your belt. And there's many, like the Rory Peck Foundation in the UK subsidizes it or does courses. So keep an eye out for that. Really important.
Besides training, besides the logistics, and besides the preparation that a journalist needs to have in order to pursue reporting in a war zone, in a conflict zone, what else this person needs to have from the point of view of his or her character? Of course, I assume that the person needs to have the guts to pursue such a risky adventure of reporting. But what are the missing parts that the majority of journalists who haven't been in war zones and they may don't want to be in war zones don't have compared to journalists like you who took the risk
You
to
know,
do something like
I
that.
I always say to people, it's not for everyone. It's absolutely, you know, in in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when newspapers were getting, they didn't have enough people to go to wars. They started sending, people from the culture desk and the home desk and I thought it was really dangerous because I think that one thing you do develop when I mean, I've reported 18 wars, I think. You get your instincts become very, very acute. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that I can't get hurt or I'm knocking on wood right now. I mean, for instance, my ex-husband, who was an extremely experienced cameraman for France 2, was shot by a sniper in Libya the day that Gaddafi fell. And, he had been reporting conflict for many, many years, had lived in Africa, was a really experienced journalist, and he just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that, all of my friends and colleagues that I've lost who have died over the years, not the ones who killed themselves, that's another story, but the ones who died. Um, I always think they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Um, Steve Sutloff and Jim Foley, the two journalists who were kidnapped by the Islamic State in Syria and were both horribly beheaded in 2015, 15, 16. They were both, they had both been going in and out of Syria. Steve spoke Arabic. Um, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then the series of events that they didn't get released was just a tragedy beyond belief. Marie Colvin, who was killed in Homs in 2012, very extremely experienced reporter from the Sunday Times. She was in her early 60s when she was killed, or 58, 59, something like that. She was literally just in the wrong building when a rocket hit. Although we do believe there are theories, and I believe that the Syrian government deliberately targeted her where she was because they knew she was there. Um, so I think that what does it take? Well, people would always say courage, right? But I don't think of myself as a very courageous person. I really don't. I just think of myself. I truly believe for me, and this is just me, I see it more as a vocation and a calling because increasingly over the past, I'd say 20 years, my job really is to get evidence, to get, documentation, so that war crime tribunals, so that when the bad guys eventually are on trial, that the evidence is there and that no one can ever say we didn't know. We had no idea this was happening. I don't want anyone to ever say that. Um, so I suppose courage, I think in my case, it helps to have a certain amount of faith that you're doing what you should be doing. Um, and also resilience. I think you need a tremendous amount of resilience because you come back from a war zone and you're in New York City or Paris or Brussels or Athens, and all around you, people are living their lives and consumers and going to restaurants and bars and parties, and you're thinking about how people are suffering in Afghanistan or Iraq, and you just can't. Your world is so different from their world, and it took me a very long time to manage to combine my life. And again, when I became a mother, um, it was harder, but it was also easier because then I set very specific boundaries of like, I wouldn't do things that I thought would get me killed or injured for just a couple lines in a newspaper. If it was going to be something that I was going to bring out that was genuinely worthwhile to humanity, to history, then I would do it. But like my editor calling me up and saying, take a quick trip to Sadr City where there was all kinds of car bombs, and just like contribute 2 lines to a story, you have to say no, because ultimately the best reporter is the one who stays alive to bring out the story. And I always say this to young reporters, like, don't be a cowboy. Don't go in there with your guns blazing thinking that you're invincible, because you're not. The number of times my colleagues and friends have been shot, blown up by minefields, hit by snipers, um, kidnapped, assassinated, or worse, sunk into heavy depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide. We're human beings. We're fragile creatures, and you can develop resilience and you can develop endurance, but you have to know how to give yourself a break. And by the way, I don't think that's just for war reporters. I think all of you foreign correspondents that covered the Trump years from 2016 to 2020 suffer a lot from something called moral injury, which is something I write a lot about now, but it's also a term that journalists who covered the refugee crisis, for instance, from Syria, if you're forced to witness something that goes against your moral core, like for instance, my moral core is that you don't tell lies, that there is justice, that everyone, that there's fair and unfair. So to see the killing of George Floyd, to see racism in America, to see Donald Trump, who's supposed to be a president, lie. Did the Washington Post say 20,000 times? I think the Washington Post documented 20,000, like lied to people. For those of us who covered the refugee crisis in, following the Syrian war in Europe, the boats coming to Greece and to coming from Africa and Europe, and people would drown. So some photographers who were on the beach had to make these terrible decisions. Do I swim out there, risk my own life, or do I stay here and do my job? And this was something that led this wonderful psychiatrist called Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who works a lot with reporters on post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. He's now working on this new study. And I truly think that anyone who lived here between 2016 and the last election witnessed things that goes against what journalism is. And also Trump hated journalists. So, we were also derided and insulted, and our worth as reporters was basically he thought unless we were Fox News, we were scum. So that, and living through COVID, I think any reporter that was covering COVID or even just witnessing it, it's been a kind of scar on all of our soul, I think.
In one of your talks, I think it was the TED talk that has more than 1 million views online, you said that one of the things that you learn through the process of reporting in war zones was that you learn about loving people, sharing, you learn about compassion, you learn about the fragile that the human beings are. Can you elaborate a little bit more how these principles have taught you and in your life, in your personal life, in your ordinary everyday life of yours?
I think empathy and compassion are some of the most important traits we possess as human beings. And it always, living in New York City, I find it so painful to walk by homeless people without talking to them, trying to give them something. And sometimes it's frustrating. I gave a guy $1 the other day and he said, can't you give me $5? But I think that, compassion and empathy isn't something you have to be in a war zone to appreciate. But I think they are things that as reporters we need to develop, because when you're interviewing someone who has been deeply affected by whether it's COVID or racism or sexism, or they're a victim of a genocide, or their family has been massacred in a genocide, you need to, one of the best things a colleague ever told me was when a man, he interviews women who are rape victims. And that's a very difficult thing to do because most rape victims, especially in countries where it's very sensitive, don't want to talk to a man. But what he does, he said, to kind of deepen his own empathy, is he pretends, he visualizes them as his mother or his sister, or a friend. And, I always tell my students at Yale, or now with this UN project I'm running, when you interview people, you need to make sure they're in a safe place, right? So, especially if they're people that have been um, raped or ethnically cleansed from their homes, or have witnessed horrific things. You need to make sure that they feel safe, because the last thing you want to do as a reporter is re-traumatize them. So you have to take great care. And I've seen television reporters, going into like injured children and putting cameras in their faces, and it makes me want to scream, because I know getting a story is important, and I know it probably wasn't that cameraman's fault, but his editor harassing him to bring the story back. But these are human beings, and they're already traumatized, like deeply traumatized. So you have to be so attentive. And one of my colleagues also, I think, told me one of the best words of advice for any journalist, to ask someone who's gone through anything um, terrible. The question is, what happened to you? What happened to you? That's it. That's all you really have to ask. And then you can sit and you have to listen. And this is the other great skill I think I've learned over the years. You have to be a good listener. And we all know people that talk at us all the time, and they never stop and actually absorb what you're saying, or what your body language is telling me, or the atmosphere in the room. Your intuition is hugely important, but so is your listening skills. And as reporters, this is probably the most crucial thing we can do, is learn how to listen. And sometimes you might sit in silence for a while. Sometimes you might have to come back several times. Um, Sometimes you might not get the answer you want. And I've also seen people twist someone's answer to make it fit into what they want to say, or they put words into someone they're interviewing's mouth, like they'll guide them to give the answer they want. This is not journalism, which goes back to your original question, like, what do I think about journalism today as opposed to old school journalism? I don't think it's a matter of like a young reporter or an older reporter. I just think it's a matter of sensitivity, and also having a responsibility to get the quotes right, the story right, to do research before you go into it, to know something about the person you're going to talk to be able to, read a couple books about it if you can. Not just take for granted that your interview is going to tell you everything. You need to do the research first. Sometimes when you're in the field, and I worked before internet, believe it or not. I didn't get my first email account until like 1995. So before that, like, and there weren't cell phones. I mean, this is hard for many people to imagine, and there weren't even computers, laptops. We had something called, oh gosh, a Tandy, and it was a kind of like box that you carried around, and it had batteries. But how we got our stories out was we literally used a satellite phone to dictate our copy, like word by word. So Thanos, Thanos, and the person on the other line in London would say, "Did you say Khanos?" And you would go back and forth, and it would take hours. So, which leads me to my final point that you said, what characteristics do we need? Patience. Patience. Sometimes you'd go to a country and it's a closed country, like Afghanistan was under the Taliban and probably will be again, like Chechnya. even like the Sarajevo, these are closed places, and they're closed for a reason, which means, in my mind, if people don't want you in